Hello and welcome to TTF's Learning Matters, a podcast where we discuss all matters related to learning. Well, we're saying learning, but it's actually gaps in learning in the wake of the long pandemic that has teachers in schools all over the world tied up in knots. What's a learning gap? I think something that we call a disparity between what a student has actually learned and what he or she is expected to learn at a particular grade. So in other words, it's the gap between the expected and the actuals in terms of learning. So what do we do to bridge this gap? Should there be short-term measures, long-term measures? To discuss this with us, we have two very dynamic educators who have demonstrated remarkable leadership, of course, even much before the pandemic, but during and post the pandemic, there was some exemplary leadership because of which their respective teams not just tided over the vagaries of the pandemic, but are now making a seamless transition back to school. We're delighted to have with us Rekha Chari, Head of Elementary Curriculum and Advocacy and Outreach at Mallya Aditi International School, and Vijai Rajagopal, Director, Vidyaniketan Public School. Both of these schools are based in Bangalore. Welcome to this podcast, Rekha and Vijay. Somewhere this word learning gaps, buzzword, it's almost been the talk of the town. Would you agree that somewhere, if these gaps, they came out, they manifested, it was because there was always some gap in our system, some deficiency, some inherent deficiency in our system, which was sort of magnified in the pandemic, due to the pandemic?
See, when you look at the notion of learning, right, even under normal circumstances, if there were something like that, there are going to be differences in the way people learn. That is something that all of us know. And there is going to be a variance in the degree to which people have learned. And that is something that as schools, we have always witnessed with our students, with our teachers. And at that point, nobody really pointed it out as a gap. It was not, making the poster headline saying that there is a gap. With every passing year, when children passed out from one class to the next, every teacher who has handled that particular cohort and moved to the next definitely knew the concepts, the applications, or the knowledge that children lacked, right? But we chose to tell ourselves that it's okay. In the next year, that kind of a deficit is going to be covered. But is there a gap? Was there a gap? The answer is yes. Of course, there are gaps, right? The question is the quantum of the gap, like you rightly said. And was it amplified because of all the rhetoric and the literature around learning gaps? Indeed. So to your question, of course, there have been, learning gaps. Of course, there are concepts that the students should have ideally learned well in order to move to the next grade level. But this is not a problem that we've never confronted in the past. And indeed, it is an amplified situation because schools that heavily relied on online teaching, almost every school did that. There have been occasions when the teachers were not getting the right kind of feedback from the students for whatever reasons. Now, I don't want to get into the reasons now, but if the feedback did not come in the manner that it should have, then the teachers are also not entirely convinced that that learning has indeed happened. And if you look at it as a continuum, it is bound to create those deficits in learning. That is my view on learning gaps, right?
Thank you, Vijay, for those words. I think I completely echo what he's saying. Are there gaps in a normal in-person school? Were there gaps in learning before the pandemic hit us? There always were, like you said. And you're very right in saying that we always thought, next year we'll catch up. We'll make up for those gaps. Was it more because of the online lessons and shorter lessons and, in the inability to complete the coursework, as one would say? Perhaps I would say on the contrary, because what we saw was in terms of the curriculum. And when I talk about curriculum, I'm saying just the syllabus or whatever the prescribed content was. Teachers found themselves to be far more organized, far more, they were staying on track. 30 minutes was the time limit. And, our classes in our school are 50 minutes long. And we know that student attention is about 20 minutes in the younger classes, especially. So teachers even now talk about how their teaching experiences were so, excellent, remarkable, because they stayed on track. Students knew what to do. There was no time to waste. You did, you were quick, you finished, completed things in 30 minutes. And they feel that they did go into nitty-gritties far more, because students were more focused online rather than here when they're distracted in person. But that's part of the learning, being in person, and that's part of the school life. Just when there are 30 kids, there's this big space, you can run around, you can walk around, and you have the liberty. That's part of the. So yes, there have been gaps in terms of knowledge. Probably, definitely, because when we saw, like Vijay said, when they came back in the last 8 weeks, some of them were just pulling a blank when you asked them something, and you thought they had understood everything. And so then that's the question. Then there's the question about, was it the skills that they developed? Was it those attitudes? Or are we now focused on the knowledge? I think we did whatever best we could. Yes, there will be learning gaps. We will have to now navigate this. We will have to now learn how to fill those gaps, how to bridge those gaps. And we are now, again, that's a new experience. How do we bridge those gaps? And especially I speak for younger students who haven't been to school in the last 2 years. And if they're entering first grade or kindergarten without having any formal education, then there's a huge gap. So how do we address this? And this is new learning again for us. Taking it slow is the mantra right now.
There's one more point that needs to be deliberated. You see, even if schools had strategies to spread it out, right? Spread out the learning over a larger time continuum, the policies and the diktats that we were receiving as schools was also not helping. Because when Rekha spoke about younger children, there were time limitations on the number of minutes, number of, perhaps 1 hour of engagement. So even if teachers had planned a longer engagement strategy by which they could have ensured that they got individual feedback from the students to the best extent possible, they couldn't do it because the policy diktat was contrary to what they would have ideally wanted. So you can't just blame it on the fact that students did not focus or students did not care. Those can't be the only reasons why the gaps exist. We'll have to be more holistic in our analysis of what happened, right?
Absolutely, I agree. There are certain policies that didn't help, I think, during the pandemic and during our transition to the online learning. It's been great talking to both of you, Vijay and Rekha. Your points and your perspectives have been so interesting. It's going to give our listeners a lot of new ideas. Thank you both so much for being a part of this podcast.
Make sure you check out our next podcast with Rekha Chari and Vijai Rajagopal, where we discuss different ways of identifying and dealing with learning gaps.